In the world of action cinema, the ending is often the ultimate payoff, the moment when everything a film has built toward finally detonates. But what if the ending you saw in theaters wasn't the one originally written? What if the climax was reshaped, rewritten, or even completely reversed because the lead actor demanded it? In Hollywood's golden age of action, the late 80s through the early 2000s, a handful of stars held so much power that their contracts, their image, or simply their ego could override the director's vision. And when that happened, the ending of a movie could change overnight. Some actors refused to die on screen. Others didn't want their characters to appear weak, flawed, or morally compromised. There were stars who rejected plot twists that made them look anything less than heroic. And on certain productions, entire finales were reshot at enormous cost just to satisfy a leading man who believed the original ending didn't fit his brand. These weren't small adjustments. Many of these changes bent or even broke the story's core, reshaping the movie into something entirely different from what the writers planned. The results. A collection of action films where the final cut hides a much darker, stranger, or more dramatic ending that audiences never got to see. Hidden storylines, abandoned deaths, erased betrayals, even complete reversals of who wins and who loses. These endings didn't vanish because they were bad. They vanished because the most powerful person on set insisted on it. Today we're opening that vault. These are 15 action movies where the lead actor changed the ending sometimes to protect their image, sometimes to satisfy a contract, and sometimes simply because they wanted the last word. And as we peel back the curtain, you'll discover just how different some of these films were meant to be, and how one star's demand can alter the fate of an entire story. Fact 1. Marked for Death. When Marked for Death first entered production, the script carried a distinctly darker tone than what audiences ultimately saw. The original ending followed a harsher, more psychologically punishing trajectory for John Hatcher, a worn-down DEA agent trying to carve out a clean path after years of violence. In early drafts, Hatcher did not emerge victorious in the glossy, invincible fashion typical of action heroes of the era. Instead, the film was intended to deliver a sobering finale. Hatcher would kill the antagonist, but emotionally and morally collapse in the aftermath, shaken by what he had become. The final pages emphasized the weight of violence catching up with him, leaving him a broken figure rather than a triumphant one. But Steven Seagal rejected that idea outright. By the time Marked for Death was being filmed, Seagal had meticulously cultivated an on-screen persona. A controlled, almost untouchable warrior who operated with absolute confidence. A vulnerable, spiritually fractured ending clashed with his carefully built brand. Reports from crew members suggest that Seagal pushed back strongly against any implication that Hatcher might be psychologically damaged or morally compromised. He wanted the character to exit the film with the stoic certainty of a man who had done exactly what needed to be done. Nothing more, nothing less. The studio, aware of Seagal's growing box office pull, sided with him. The ending was rewritten to portray Hatcher not as a man weighed down by violence, but as a hero who dispatches evil without the slightest hint of weakness. The final cut removes nearly all emotional consequence, replacing introspection with a clean, victorious stride into the sunset. What audiences saw was not the film the writers initially envisioned. It was the film reshaped to preserve Seagal's cinematic mythology, an ending altered not by narrative logic, but by the will of its star. Fact 2. The Glimmer Man, 1996. For The Glimmer Man, the original script carried an ending far more brutal and morally decisive than the one that reached theaters. In its earliest form, the story culminated with the death of the movie's central killer, a symbolic measure meant to fully close the emotional wounds haunting Jack Cole, a former government assassin seeking redemption. The climax was written to force Cole to confront the violent past he had tried to bury. Killing the antagonist was meant to be an act of closure, a painful yet necessary step toward reclaiming his humanity. But Steven Seagal had other ideas. By this point in the 90s, Seagal had begun leaning heavily into a particular cinematic identity. A warrior of spiritual depth, someone who walked a higher path and believed in forgiveness over execution. Eliminating the villain in cold-blooded finality violated both that persona and Seagal's personal philosophy regarding on-screen violence. Crew members later explained that Seagal insisted the ending should reflect compassion, not revenge. The killer could not die. Instead, the hero needed to rise above hatred and choose mercy even towards someone who clearly did not deserve it. This demand forced writers to overhaul the entire final act. The original violent confrontation was softened into a far more restrained resolution. Instead of a lethal showdown, the film pivots into a quasi-spiritual beat in which Cole chooses restraint. The villain survives not because the story required it, but because Seagal believed it made his character appear wiser, calmer, and closer to the enlightened figure he wanted audiences to see. The rewrite came at the expense of the narrative's emotional weight. What was once a cathartic confrontation became a morally ambiguous ending that many viewers found puzzling. Yet the decision stands as one of the clearest examples of an actor reshaping a film's conclusion to match their personal and professional image. Fact 3. Fire Down Below, 1997. Fire Down Below originally carried one of the bleakest endings of Steven Seagal's 90s filmography, an ending so dark that it clashed violently with the clean, heroic persona he had built through the decade. Early drafts of the script concluded with the protagonist, EPA agent Jack Taggart, confronting the overwhelming corruption, poisoning the Appalachian community he was fighting to save. The story's final movement emphasized the crushing reality of environmental devastation and the moral futility of challenging entrenched power. In the original ending, Taggart's battle ended in despair. Evidence destroyed, allies silenced, and the protagonist left in a moment of emotional collapse that hinted at self-destruction. According to production insiders, one version of this ending even suggested suicide, not literally shown on screen, but heavily implied through visual language and dialogue. It was meant to underline the hopelessness of the situation, turning the film into a grim commentary rather than a triumphant action narrative. Seagal refused. The actor reportedly insisted that Jack Taggart could not end the film in a state of despair or moral defeat. Anything resembling a suicide implication was immediately scrapped. He demanded a rewrite that reframed the character as a beacon of resilience, not a tragic casualty of systemic evil. The new ending replaced hopelessness with resolution. The villain is exposed. Justice prevails, and Taggart emerges as a grounded, morally centered hero. To accommodate this shift, the tone of the entire final act changed. Scenes of ambiguity were removed or reshot, and the emotional breakdown originally planned for Taggart was eliminated entirely. The studio supported Seagal's decision, believing a darker ending would alienate audiences expecting a traditional action hero victory. What survives in the final cut bears almost no resemblance to the ending the film was built to deliver. It wasn't the story that changed, it was the star who refused to allow his character to fall. Fact 4. Showdown in Little Tokyo, 1991. When Showdown in Little Tokyo was first conceived, the script contained a twist that would have dramatically altered how audiences perceived its stoic protagonist, Chris Kenner. In early drafts, Kenner wasn't just a relentless cop driven by trauma. He was a man hiding a deeply compromising secret. The planned twist revealed that Kenner had once collaborated with the very criminal syndicate he was now trying to dismantle, a narrative turn designed to add moral ambiguity and psychological tension to the film's final act. The ending would force Kenner to confront the consequences of his past betrayal, making the climactic showdown as much an internal battle as an external one. Dolph Lundgren refused immediately. Lundgren, whose rising status in action cinema was built on portraying physically imposing but morally straightforward heroes, felt that allowing Kenner to harbor a history of corruption would undermine the character. Reports from the creative team later indicated that Lundgren believed such a twist would weaken Kenner's heroic presence and confuse audiences expecting a clear-cut protagonist. He argued that the betrayal subplot not only damaged the character's integrity, but also detracted from the film's lighter, more stylized tone. As a result, the twist was removed completely. All hints of Kenner's morally ambiguous past were eliminated, replaced by a more conventional, heroic arc. Instead of confronting a shadow from his own history, Kenner becomes a classic Avenger, a victim of childhood trauma seeking justice against the gang that destroyed his family. The altered ending shifts the emotional weight away from self-confrontation and toward external vengeance. The final cut reflects Lundgren's preference for a cleaner, more heroic persona. What could have been a morally layered ending became a straightforward resolution, dictated by the star's insistence that his character remain untainted. Fact 5. The Patriot. 1998. Unlike many of Steven Seagal's earlier films, The Patriot was structured from the beginning as a more grounded, introspective thriller. One that emphasized moral consequences over straightforward heroics. The original ending was starkly different from what ended up on screen. Early script drafts portrayed Dr. Wesley McLaren as a man pushed beyond his limits, grappling with the collapse of society around him as a deadly biological outbreak swept through the region. The tone was somber, almost nihilistic. In the original conclusion, McLaren succeeded in slowing the epidemic, but failed to save those he cared about, leaving him isolated and emotionally shattered. The final scene depicted a world beginning to rebuild, but McLaren himself was left broken, a quiet casualty of the crisis. Seagal rejected this direction entirely. By the late 90s, Seagal was fiercely protective of his on-screen persona as an unwavering, morally unshakable force. A protagonist who ended the movie emotionally devastated did not align with that image. According to accounts from individuals tied to production, Seagal pushed for an ending that emphasized hope, recovery, and personal triumph. He insisted that McLaren should stand as a symbol of resilience, not a victim of emotional or psychological collapse. To accommodate this, the ending underwent significant changes. Scenes depicting McLaren's despair were removed. Any hint of lingering trauma was softened or rewritten. The final montage was restructured to present a community healed, a threat neutralized, and a protagonist who walks away, centered and composed, not weighed down by tragedy. The ending that audiences saw was fundamentally different from the bleak, human-focused finale originally envisioned. It was transformed to reinforce Seagal's preference for characters who rise above hardship without suffering visible emotional consequences. Fact 6. On Deadly Ground, 1994. On Deadly Ground stands as one of the clearest examples of a film whose ending was reshaped to match the lead actor's personal ideology and his desire to present a very specific screen persona. In earlier drafts, the storyline built toward a painful but realistic conclusion. Forrest Taft would fail. The eco-terrorist campaign waged by the oil conglomerate would succeed in causing catastrophic environmental damage, and Taft, despite his skill, would be left to face the harsh truth that righteousness doesn't always win. The original ending was somber, almost tragic, serving as a statement about the futility of fighting corporate corruption. But Seagal, who was becoming increasingly invested in environmental activism and spiritual themes, rejected this ending outright. Not only did he refuse to allow Taft to lose, but he insisted that the character should deliver a powerful moral message, one that extended far beyond the narrative's action elements. According to production sources, Seagal demanded a rewritten finale in which Taft not only triumphs, but also stands before a public audience to deliver a lengthy lecture on environmental responsibility and corporate greed. This speech, which many viewers found jarringly out of place, became one of the film's most notorious features. The rewrite drastically altered the film's tone. Rather than ending on a grounded, emotionally resonant note, the story pivots into a triumphant, almost sermon-like closure. Taft destroys the villain's operation, exposes their crimes, and emerges unscathed and morally superior. The film's original message that the world is complicated and victories are rarely absolute was replaced with a blunt idealistic proclamation, shaped entirely by the star's worldview. The final cut reflects Seagal's growing insistence on portraying characters who are morally invincible and philosophically enlightened. The ending wasn't changed for narrative cohesion, it was changed to fit an image. Fact 7. Hard Target, 1993. Hard Target was designed from the beginning as a brutal, stylish John Woo thriller, complete with a darker, bloodier finale that emphasized sacrifice and moral consequence. In the original ending, Chance Boudreaux wasn't meant to walk away from the final showdown unscathed. Early script drafts described a harsh, punishing climax, in which Chance barely survives emotionally and physically broken, having lost innocent lives he couldn't save. Woo's intention was clear: the hero triumphs, but at a cost embodying the director's signature blend of operatic action and tragic fallout. Jean-Claude Van Damme disagreed. Van Damme's star power was peaking at the time, and he had a firm grasp of the on-screen persona that fans expected: a charismatic, unstoppable warrior who could suffer but never appear defeated. According to multiple accounts from the production, Van Damme pushed aggressively for changes to the ending. He wanted the climax to emphasize his heroism, minimize moral ambiguity, and amplify his physical dominance. More victory, less tragedy, became the guiding principle of the rewrite. As a result, several moments originally intended to humanize Chance were removed or reshot. Scenes showing fear, hesitation, or doubt were softened. The ending shifted toward a cleaner, more triumphant tone, with Chance dispatching the villains in spectacular fashion and emerging with confidence, not trauma. Even Woo's signature emotional beats were trimmed to ensure that Van Damme looked powerful rather than wounded. The change doesn't break the film, but it dramatically reshapes its emotional resonance. What was meant to be a tragic, reflective final act became a celebration of Van Damme's screen mythology, a victory designed not for the story, but for the star. Fact 8. Death Warrant, 1990. The original ending of Death Warrant leaned heavily into a grim, unsettling conclusion, fitting for a film set deep inside a corrupt prison system. In its earliest form, Detective Louis Burke survived the final confrontation, but failed to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy controlling the penitentiary. The script ended on a morally ambiguous note. The hero lives, but evil survives, hinting that the system may be too rotten to challenge. The final scene implied that Burke might face dire consequences if he attempted to expose the truth. Jean-Claude Van Damme refused to allow an ending that portrayed the villainy as larger than the hero. Reports from those tied to the production claim that Van Damme felt the original conclusion made his character appear powerless, something that clashed with his growing reputation as a cinematic icon of strength and determination. He pushed for a rewrite that gave Burke a definitive victory and ensured that the conspiracy's ringleaders were punished on screen. The result was a noticeably more heroic final act. Villains who originally escaped justice were rewritten to die in direct confrontations. A final implication that the prison system itself would continue operating under corruption was removed entirely. Burke, instead of exiting the story, troubled and uncertain, walks away confident and resolute, having not only survived, but fully dismantled the threat. This shift changed the thematic weight of the movie. What was meant to be a cautionary tale about systemic rot became a straightforward action triumph. The rewrite didn't serve narrative complexity, it served Van Damme's desire to maintain the aura of an indomitable hero. Fact 9. Maximum Risk, 1996. Maximum Risk initially featured a tense, emotionally charged finale focused on identity loss and the blurry moral lines of undercover crime syndicates. In the original script, Alain Moreau, a man investigating the death of his twin brother, uncovers the truth, but pays a heavy price. The earliest ending described Alain confronting the corrupt agents responsible only to be severely wounded and left uncertain about whether justice would prevail. The film was meant to conclude with ambiguity. Alain survives, but the emotional and psychological toll leaves him unsure whether his brother's death was truly avenged. Van Damme rejected this ambiguity. Sources close to the production reported that Van Damme insisted on an ending that reinforced Alain's heroism. He believed the audience needed a clear, satisfying conclusion in which the villains were defeated decisively, and Alain emerged victorious. As a result, the final confrontation was rewritten to be more explosive and less introspective. Scenes depicting Alain's emotional breakdown, originally central to the story's conclusion, were softened or cut. The altered ending presents Alain as a classic Van Damme protagonist, wounded but unwavering, physically dominant, and morally certain. The villains are dispatched in a straightforward fashion, and the emotional complexity that once defined the story's conclusion is replaced by a cleaner, more conventional action movie victory. The rewrite didn't just change the tone, it changed the film's purpose. What began as a character-driven thriller exploring grief and identity was reshaped into a vehicle designed to reinforce Van Damme's heroic image. The ending audiences saw was not the story the filmmakers originally set out to tell, but the one the star insisted on delivering. Fact 10. Lethal Weapon. 1998. Lethal Weapon 4 was originally intended to end on a far more dramatic and emotionally devastating note. Early versions of the script featured a finale in which one of the main characters, either Riggs or Murtaugh, suffered life-threatening consequences in the final battle against the Triad Syndicate. The plan was to underline how years of reckless heroics and escalating violence had finally taken their toll. The franchise had matured. The characters were older, more vulnerable, and the writers wanted the ending to reflect that reality. But Mel Gibson and Danny Glover pushed back. Both stars felt strongly that the franchise should not end on a note of loss or despair. Reports suggest that Gibson in particular believed Riggs needed a hopeful ending to counterbalance the character's long history of emotional darkness. Glover, too, preferred a conclusion that reinforced the theme of found family, one that highlighted unity rather than tragedy. Their combined influence carried enormous weight within the production. As a result, the script underwent significant rewrites. Instead of a sobering finale with heavy emotional cost, the ending shifted toward forgiveness, reconciliation, and comedic warmth. The climactic fight remained intense, but the emotional stakes were softened. The final hospital scene, originally meant to be somber, was transformed into a celebration of life, fatherhood, and enduring friendship. The rewritten ending not only preserved both characters, but also reshaped the franchise's legacy. What could have been a bold, melancholic exit became a heartwarming finale, driven by the wishes of its two stars rather than the intentions of the writers. Fact 11. Tango and Cash. 1989. The turbulent production of Tango and Cash is legendary, and its ending was one of the biggest casualties of behind-the-scenes conflict. The original script featured a darker, more brutal resolution. Ray Tango and Gabe Cash infiltrate the enemy compound, but the final confrontation ends with a morally ambiguous victory. One of the villains survives systemic corruption, remains intact, and the heroes are left uncertain whether they've accomplished anything meaningful. The tone matched the gritty, cynical edge of late 80s action cinema. But Sylvester Stallone and Kurt Russell had different ideas. Stallone, who had already established a reputation for reshaping scripts to suit his image, pushed for a more triumphant finale. Russell reportedly supported a lighter, more comedic tone as well. Both stars wanted an ending that highlighted their chemistry and emphasized victory over ambiguity. The planned darker beats, including a subplot involving internal betrayal and a morally complex showdown, were cut. The ending was rewritten into a more polished, upbeat, almost playful sequence in which both heroes outsmart the villains, win decisively, and exchange comedic banter in the aftermath. The original harshness was replaced with style and swagger. The final cut feels less like a noir-inspired thriller and more like a buddy cop spectacle designed to showcase its two charismatic leads. While the rewritten ending is entertaining, it's also a clear example of how star power reshaped a film's narrative direction. What was meant to be a morally complex finale became a victory lap, crafted to match the personas of its leading men. Fact 12. Sudden Death. 1995. Sudden Death was initially conceived as a far more tragic and emotionally charged action film. In the original ending, firefighter Darren McCord fails to save everyone caught in the chaos of the terrorist attack. Though he succeeds in stopping the main villain, the cost is enormous. Innocent lives are lost and McCord is left physically and emotionally devastated. The script's final scene emphasized the crushing reality of trauma, McCord staring at the wreckage of the arena, overwhelmed by guilt and the weight of multiple failures. Jean-Claude Van Damme rejected this ending outright. Already known for portraying resilient, uncompromised heroes, Van Damme felt the ending portrayed his character as too vulnerable. According to accounts from production, he pushed for a version of the finale where McCord triumphs not only physically, but morally, ensuring that as many lives as possible were saved, and that the hero's emotional state remained intact. He wanted the character to reflect hope, strength, and control, not despair or trauma. The final act of the film was subsequently rewritten. Scenes depicting widespread casualties were minimized. McCord's emotional breakdown was removed, replaced by a clear-cut victory in which the hero saves both his children and the public. Instead of ending on a somber note, the film concludes with a sense of relief and renewed stability. The final cut loses some of the emotional intensity the writers originally intended, but it reinforces the heroic image Van Damme insisted on maintaining. The ending serves less as a reflection on trauma and more as a celebration of the star's indomitable persona. Fact 13. The Expendables. 2010. The earliest drafts of The Expendables carried a surprisingly bleak conclusion, one that stood in stark contrast to the film's explosive, larger-than-life tone. In the original script, the mercenary team suffers a heavy loss during the final assault. One of the core members, specifically written as a fan favorite, was intended to die in the climactic battle. The ending framed the team's victory as costly and bittersweet, highlighting the brutal reality of their profession and bringing emotional weight to the franchise's hyper-violent world. But the ensemble's biggest stars, particularly Sylvester Stallone, pushed back against the idea. Stallone, who both starred in and directed the film, was heavily invested in presenting the group as a unified, indestructible brotherhood. According to internal accounts, he felt that killing off a team member in the first movie would undermine the long-term potential of the franchise. Additionally, several cast members reportedly preferred maintaining an image of solidarity, not tragedy, especially in a movie built around the celebration of aging, but unstoppable action heroes. As a result, the darker ending was discarded. The death scene was cut, and the script was rewritten to ensure that every member of the team survives. Instead of tragedy, the finale became a triumphant display of teamwork, camaraderie, and explosive spectacle. The final moments emphasize unity, drinking together in the bar, celebrating victory and reinforcing the theme of loyalty above all. The change ultimately reshaped The Expendables into a more optimistic action fantasy, not driven by narrative consequence, but by the collective preferences of its star-studded cast. Fact 14. Universal Soldier. The Return. 1999. In its initial conception, Universal Soldier, The Return was meant to carry a dark, introspective ending that echoed the tone of the franchise's earlier installments. The original script concluded with Luke Devereaux facing a devastating truth as a resurrected super soldier struggling with fragmented humanity. He ultimately fails to prevent a catastrophic loss. The film was intended to end with Devereaux severely wounded, traumatized, and confronted by the realization that he could never fully return to the person he once was. Van Damme rejected this direction entirely. By 1999, Van Damme was distancing himself from darker, psychologically tormented characters. He wanted Devereaux to emerge not as a haunted experiment, but as a triumphant action hero, reclaiming control over his life. Reports from the production suggest that Van Damme pushed for a finale that emphasized clear victory redemption and a restored sense of identity. He wanted Devereaux to be the one who saves everyone, not the one left questioning his humanity. As a result, the entire climax was rewritten. The original bleak ending in which the AI-driven SETH threatens global catastrophe and Devereaux fails to stop it in time was replaced with a more explosive, straightforward showdown. Instead of emotional collapse, Devereaux defeats the villain, protects the innocent, and walks away physically, battered but morally intact. The emotional ambiguity at the heart of the original story was lost, replaced by a victory engineered to maintain Van Damme's heroic brand. The franchise shifted from science fiction tragedy to high-energy action showcase as a direct result of the star's influence. Fact 15. Out for Justice, 1991. The earliest versions of Out for Justice included an ending that was far darker and more morally complex than the theatrical cut. In the original script, Detective Gino Felino's obsessive pursuit of Richie Madano spirals into a violent rampage that leaves the protagonist morally compromised. The final confrontation was written not as a cathartic victory, but as a grim display of how vengeance had consumed Felino. After killing Richie, Felino was meant to face internal investigation, with hints that he might lose his badge or even face charges, a sobering commentary on the thin line between justice and brutality. Steven Seagal refused to accept an ending that portrayed his character as anything less than ethically righteous. Insiders from the production have revealed that Seagal insisted the film portray Felino as a morally justified force of nature, not a man losing control. He pushed for rewrites that removed any suggestion of wrongdoing or consequence. The internal investigation subplot was cut completely. Scenes depicting Felino's escalating rage were trimmed or reworked to frame him as a protector rather than an unstable vigilante. The ending was transformed accordingly. Instead of facing accountability, Felino kills Richie in a decisive, heroic manner. The film then shifts into an almost celebratory mode. Felino walks away victorious, receives praise from colleagues, and resumes his normal life with barely a hint of emotional fallout. The darker commentary on police violence and obsessive justice vanished entirely. What was originally meant to be a grounded, morally challenging finale was reshaped into a straightforward triumph. Another example of a leading actor altering a film's ending to protect his on-screen identity. Bonus fact: the ending changed for a completely unexpected reason. Among the stranger cases of altered endings in action cinema sits a film whose conclusion was rewritten not for narrative clarity, not for audience satisfaction, and not even for contractual power, but because the lead actor demanded a very specific condition. Their character could not be shown, bleeding, injured, or visibly weakened in any frame of the final scene. The film's original ending, never publicly released, featured the hero staggering away from the final battle, battered and barely conscious, having survived only through sheer will. The moment was raw, grounded, and intended to humanize the character. Makeup tests were completed, scenes were rehearsed, practical effects were ready to shoot. But shortly before filming the finale, the lead actor abruptly objected. According to accounts from crew members, the actor insisted that showing blood or visible injury would damage the hero's aura and weaken their iconic image. They demanded that the climax be rewritten to ensure the character remained physically pristine. No cuts, no bruises, no exhaustion. Even the costume department was instructed to avoid torn fabric or dirt. The rewrite that followed was drastic. The original gritty exit was replaced with a clean, almost surreal departure. The villain defeated the hero standing tall and untouched, delivering a stoic one-liner before walking away as if the entire fight had required no effort at all. The shift baffled the creative team. What was meant to be an emotional, grounded closing beat became a glossy, almost mythic victory that ignored the brutality of the preceding action. This case remains one of the clearest examples of a star altering a film's ending, for a reason that had nothing to do with story and everything to do with image. If you've made it this far, you now know just how different these films could have been, and how much power a single actor can wield over the final cut. Now it's your turn. Which of these altered endings surprised you the most? And which original version do you wish you could see restored? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you want more hidden stories, lost versions, and behind-the-scenes secrets from the world of action cinema, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. There's a lot more still undone.